Well, with us to debate that are Kevin Courtney, who's the Deputy General Secretary of the NUT, and John Blake, one of the prominent NUT moderates who's recently left over precisely these kinds of concerns. Kevin, listening to that, hearing again that the NUT is planning to strike, hearing again that they are resisting basically all the government's changes, and hearing that there are militants standing, parents would be forgiven for thinking you're obsessed with your own left-wing politics rather than standards in the classroom and what's best for children.
Well, if that was the entirely accurate picture of the weekend, maybe they'd have some justification. But we've spent time debating whether 4 is too young to test children. We've been debating the questions of primary curriculum and assessment. We've been debating that Michael Gove is giving £45 million to the Harris Academy chain to set up a hyper-selective...
And voting to strike again, and hearing from militants who are planning to stand as candidates who are still advocating policies like that and suggesting that Bob Crow is a good model.
Certainly we've been discussing further strike action, but you have to understand why that is. Since Michael Gove came to power, teacher workloads have gone up by between 10 and 20%. And those extra hours, primary teachers now working 60 hours a week, the extra hours that have gone up are not spent on preparing exciting lessons for children.
Well, let's hear from John here, because John is one of the moderates in the union who believe that you were forced out because of this rising tendency of militancy. What was your experience?
Well, my experience in the NUT, I mean, I joined in 2005 when it was an organisation that was already fairly thinly tethered to reality. And by the time I left, it had detached itself entirely. I mean, conference is an extremely unpleasant experience to go in if you're not willing to walk in the orthodoxy of the NUT. It's a very narrow idea of what it means to be left-wing, of what it means to be a teacher, and of what it means to be a teacher activist. I mean, if I'll give you one example, I gave a speech at one conference in which I suggested that a group of teachers talking about going out on a general strike was not particularly helpful either to the union or to the labour movement in general. And I was denounced by the leader of the moderate faction on the NUT executive as outrageously right-wing.
Well, Kevin,
it's ridiculous.
Are you proud of that? Somewhere, a culture where people feel that they can't stand up and say what they think?
I don't recognise John's version of that. John was an NUT rep in a school in Camden where I was the branch secretary, a very good NUT rep. I encouraged John onto our local committee,
he
brought
clearly
him to
feels
conference
that your colleagues bullied him out.
because we are a broad church. And John has decided to leave the NUT, and everybody's entitled to make those decisions.
I mean, I'd say, and you know, I will say this about Kevin. And Kevin is a very kind and generous trade union activist. But the branch of which we were both members, after I went to conference for that first time, attempted to bring in a motion to ban people speaking on issues that had been pre-decided in tiny meetings that took place long before conference started.
So who then is the NUT representing? If there is no place for moderates like John, which clearly he feels very seriously there is not, who do you purport really to be representing then?
John has made a decision to leave the NUT, but he's criticising not just the NUT, but the NASUWT. He criticised the NASUWT this weekend, saying that Chris Keats was wrong to say that teacher morale was so low.
But you're suggesting that
John is in a very peculiar position.
Teachers are being represented by the NUT. The voice of the teacher in classrooms around England and Wales is being represented effectively when you have not been able to block academy schools, which you wanted to do. You've not been able to block free schools. The pension and pay policies are going ahead.
We've got representation in the free schools, we've got representation in the academies. Our joint strike action with the ATL improved the position on pensions. Our joint boycott of the SATs with the NAHT has slightly improved those. The joint action that we took with the NASUWT last year stopped the school teacher review body damaging teacher conditions, and that's very important. It was a huge setback for Michael Gove, unprecedented for that body to turn down a secretary of state in the way that it did.
It was small beer. John?
I mean, I think Kevin is massively overstating the case. I mean, it's certainly true that striking with the ATL made some slight and quite important differences to the pension campaign, but it was Kevin and others who decided that the NUT would carry that on ad infinitum to this point where it's another round of strike action, but because they didn't get very far on pensions, they were going to add something else into it, so now this time it'll be about workload or something else. And it's not the case that the SATs boycott achieved anything very much at all. And in fact, the NAHT is now in the point where they're not willing to work with the NUT over those kind of things, because the NUT has pushed itself into this militant position and detached itself from the mainstream of teachers, from staff rooms, and from the mainstream of politics generally.
John is completely wrong about the NAHT not being willing to work with us, and is out on a limb when he says that workload isn't an issue that is a great
I'd like to put a particular point to you, John. as a union and as a membership organisation, isn't it, however, entirely the NUT's role to be bolshy, to be radical, in order to try to effect change? And maybe if your party, because you represent Labour teachers, was doing a better job of opposing education reforms, the NUT wouldn't have to be so spiky and behaving this way.
I don't think that's the case at all. I think the NUT, I mean, in one sense, you're absolutely correct. The NUT's members, it's their problem if the NUT wanders off the political mainstream to the point where it has no influence at all. But the problem for all of us as teachers is the NUT is seen as our representative voice. We need a representative voice that is sensible, capable of actually engaging with government policy and being proactive and forward-thinking. You talked earlier about the overwhelming opposition to academies the NUT has offered. Well, there are thousands of teachers who work in academies. Where are those teachers getting their decent representation from?
And they're represented at our conference.
Kevin, just finally to you, when was the last time, if there is one you can remember, that the NUT actually supported a government policy?
Well, let me turn that round and ask you, when was the last time that Michael Gove listened to his critics?
Well, we're asking you when the last time you supported his policy was. When was the last time? Maybe it was under the last government.
OK, we supported Michael Gove when he said that teachers would be given anonymity for accusations by children. That was in 2010. We didn't support him closing down the London Challenge. We don't support this radical expansion of academies with no evidence. He just decries his opponents all the time as the blob, and that's why teachers are so angry with him.
All right, well, we must leave it there, but thank you both very much indeed.